Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, The Myth of American Democracy. We are members of the waycj education team. I'm Tanvi, she, her pronouns. Do the other presenters want to introduce themselves?
Yeah, I'm Caroline. I also use she, her pronouns.
I'm Joshua, and I use any pronouns.
Cool. So today we will be discussing why the US isn't really a democracy. And if you want to and are able, we would encourage you to take notes, as it can really help you retain the knowledge you gain from this, and you will be able to look back on them later.
America is the freest country in the world is something that we have often heard said, but how often do we hear people say that America's the most democratic country, or that it's the most accountable country, or that it's the least corrupt country? We hardly ever hear people say these things, probably because they're not true.
In terms of freedom, the right-wing Cato Institute ranks the United States in 15th place, below Estonia, Australia, and the United Kingdom. The Economist Democracy Index ranks the United States in 25th place, below Costa Rica, Chile, and South Korea. The Transparency Corruption Index puts the United States in 23rd place, beneath the United Arab Emirates, which is literally an absolute monarchy. And no evidence indicates that the United States excels in any of these aspects. Going beyond studies conducted by Koch brother-owned think tanks, we should look at our country's actual history.
After the United States split off from Great Britain, our founding fathers wrote about instituting a government to protect off the rich from the rule of the people. James Madison, the author of the Constitution, wrote that the government ought to be so constituted as to protect the opulent minority against the majority. Alexander Hamilton referred to the will of the people as a great beast. It is undeniable that our government was written by and for the rich, not to protect the people, but private property. John Adams wrote, "The moment the idea is admitted into society that property is not as sacred as the laws of God, and that there is not a force of law and public justice to protect it, anarchy and tyranny will commence." Our Constitution contains principles which, at the time, may have been necessary to develop unity among the colonies, but are now blatantly anti-democratic.
The Supreme Court, for example, is a group of unelected individuals with no formal qualifications required, who get the opportunity for life to decide what is constitutional. This isn't to deny that great progress has come from the courts. Brown v. Board of Education and Roe v. Wade have both positively impacted the lives of millions. But just as equally, Council of Sherrill v. Oneida Indians, Shelby County v. Holder, Citizens United v. FEC have also negatively affected the lives of millions. This is hardly any restitution for those decisions. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the nation. There is none other you can appeal to. Their decisions, unchecked and unaccountable, are practically infallible for decades after they are made. The result of this is that crimes of slavery, segregation, and genocide were able to be perpetrated for far longer than the people wanted. Of course, they shouldn't have happened even if the people wanted them to, because those are horrible things. Even further in the Constitution, undemocratic elements include enslaved people who at the time made up 18% of the population, were legally considered to be a third of a human for tax purposes. Congress was empowered to make treaties with indigenous people and broke all 500 of them.
The Electoral College was set up to satisfy small states, but has resulted in the average person in Wyoming having more say in choosing a president than the average person in California, 7 times as much. In addition to the geographic discrepancy, there are only about 4 states where high emphasis is placed on winning the election: Michigan, Florida, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. These so-called swing states account for 15% of the general population, but 32% of the electoral votes needed to win. Individual votes do not account for much in states with a high favoring to one party, such as Washington with the Democratic Party. Because of this, candidates are less likely to campaign in these states. The Electoral College also only leaves room for the Democrat and Republican Party, virtually eliminating any third-party votes, whether it was in the hundreds of thousands or millions.
Non-constitutional law is corrupt as well. It is entirely legal for corporations to hold immense power over our public officials. During the 1970s and 80s, big corporations realized that by spending millions towards lobbying, they could increase their profits in tremendous amounts. Corporate lobbyists describe that the reason they were there was to protect the company against changes in government policy.
Take pharmaceutical lobbying, otherwise known as Big Pharma, for example. One of the reasons essential healthcare, such as insulin, costs multiple times its cost of production is because of their lobbying. Since 1999, the pharmaceutical and health industry has spent nearly $5 billion on lobbying, leading to increased leniency on drug pricing. That money could have gone towards making medicine more affordable or towards curing cancer or something else, but no, they had to go and buy our government. 98 out of 100 senators and 414 out of 435 representatives take money from Big Pharma. 95% of all our congresspeople are beholden to these corporate interests, and not just from Big Pharma. 100% of the House and Senate has taken money from the insurance and banking industries, including AOC, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren.
On top of this, lawmakers from almost every state have been or are members of the American Legislative Exchange Council. This nonpartisan organization brings corporations and legislators together to vote on bills in their own interest and has been in existence for over 40 years. Corporations currently in the coalition include Pfizer, Shell Oil, Koch Industries, Boeing, and T-Mobile. Some famous bills passed that were created by ALEC include mandatory minimums, the 3 strikes provision, the stand your ground law, and photo IDs for voting. It's no surprise that ALEC has had an extensive role in voter suppression over the past 2 decades as the founder of this organization. Paul Weyrich said, "Our leverage in the elections goes up as the voting populace goes down." This open admission is critical to understanding how it is in the interests of the rich for ordinary people to remain complacent. This is accomplished by the continuation of those aforementioned policies, like ID requirements and mandatory minimums.
Approximately 6 million people in the US are prohibited from voting because they have a felony conviction or are currently imprisoned. An additional 36 million people do not have ready access to a government-issued photo ID. These means of voter suppression are disproportionate between races. 1 in 13 Black people cannot vote due to a prior felony conviction, a rate 4 times greater than non-Black voters. Additionally, a study found that while 81% of white people have access to a government-issued photo ID, only 55% of Black people do. If we deny the right to vote to those in prison, the government is incentivized to incarcerate political dissidents.
Another way that money influences government is the practice of overthrowing democratic governments which have policies contrary to U.S. corporate interests. Since World War II, the United States has been involved with the regime change of over 70 times in dozens of countries, particularly in the global South.
In the 70s, the democratically elected president of Chile, Salvador Allende, instituted popular policies that allowed Chile to take back control of their copper industry. He also promoted social democratic legislation that included increasing literacy and employment. However, the United States, with a vested interest in the copper industry, was furious, having spent millions of dollars running anti-Allende political ads prior to his election. President Nixon authorized the CIA to prevent him from coming to power, and in 1973, armed forces aided by the US military, stormed the executive office and put General Augusto Pinochet into power, beginning a 19-year dictatorship that would result in the deaths or, quote, disappearances of over 70,000 people.
This cycle of democracy to dictatorship has been perpetuated over and over again by the United States, using every resource available to them, be it economic, social, or military. In the 1950s, Iran was on track to become your average liberal democracy until their president nationalized the oil industry. Until their president who nationalized the oil industry was put under house arrest by the US military and was replaced by the Shah, creating another violent dictatorship.
Also in the 50s, Jacobo Arbenz, the president of Guatemala, was brought forward dozens of positive reforms, including abolishing the feudalistic peonage system, or working off debts in prison, instituting the nation's first minimum wage, and allowing poor farmers to once again own the lands they farmed. The American-based United Fruit Company had thrived off the previous lack of regulation in Guatemala and pleaded with Washington to overthrow Arbenz. They did and put into power several military leaders before settling for Carlos Castillo Armas, a right-wing dictator who arrested thousands of dissidents and reversed many of the policies set forth by Arbenz. For decades, the people of Guatemala struggled with the authoritarian leaders who were aligned closely to the US.
Last year, the popular president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, was ousted by a right-wing coup supported by our government, including everyone's favorite girl boss, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. He has been a champion of indigenous rights and of the poor. Battles between protesters and the military raged, and many indigenous people were murdered in mass. This year, as elections rolled around again, his party, Movement Towards Socialism, has swept Congress and regained the presidency. Countries and regions such as the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Afghanistan, Iraq, and many more still face the detrimental effects of American imperialism. But this cycle will continue unless corporations lose their power in the government.
Even our most liberal politicians are beneficiaries of these corporations. Liberal politicians are still politicians who, as a result of the ingrained anti-democratic practices of our government, are ultimately unaccountable to the people.